Tom and I are pleased to have the opportunity to talk about a book and some of the ideas in it that we had the good fortune of editing with about 30 of our colleagues from around the world, called Psychedelic Medicine. So what I'm going to do in the first part of the talk is speak to what I think are some of the major implications that come from the work of many of the researchers around the world who have been looking at these diverse substances for the last 30, 40 years. The first thing I was going to say is that looking at these substances is not something particularly new. As I will suggest in a talk that I give on Sunday, I think there's a good reason to believe that humans have been ingesting these substances intentionally or unintentionally for perhaps as long as 5 million years, and that there's now, I think, good genetic evidence to indicate that we evolved or co-evolved through the use of these substances. So I will, on Sunday, substantiate Terence McKenna's hypothesis, which with research that's been done in the last several years. Clearly, the middle upper Paleolithic transition 40,000 years ago, the advent of modern cultural consciousness, is something that clearly has major shamanic elements, and many people would say also has clear evidence of the use of a variety of psychedelic drugs. However, the Western world didn't manage to maintain much of that ancient knowledge, and when we as Westerners started to record this information, it was largely considered to be the witch's brew, and evidence of knowledge of those substances or their use was generally sufficient to have you tortured to death. So this knowledge has been lying dormant in our unconscious and in many parts of the world for thousands of years, and it's been only in the last 100, 150 years that we've started to see a minor resurgence of it. Unfortunately, much of what might have been known from the many cultures that were using these plants 500 years ago when the Western colonization of the Americas began was also brutally destroyed, and in many cases did not come back to light until, once again, only about 50 years ago. However, since about the mid-19th century, anthropologists deliberately and sometimes unwittingly have begun to record information about the use of a variety of different substances, often in context in which they had little knowledge of what the substances were or actually did. Only a few brave souls actually turned to the use of the substances as a mechanism for finding out why indigenous peoples considered them important. But over the last 150 years, we have discovered amazing variety of uses for these substances. To me, it's quite incredible to discover that the same substance might be used for depression as well as for anger, for people who have sores on their feet or sores on their head, people with intestinal parasites or skin parasites. We can find the same plant used for marital problems and for people who want to fall in love, as well as for people who want to fall out of love, or in some societies to encourage licentiousness, and in others to encourage adherence to some notion of a sexual moral standard. I know throughout the Amazonian basin, the same substances are used to prepare for warfare with other villages, as well as to engage in peace negotiations with other villages. We find that these substances will be used for witchcraft and to protect you against witchcraft, to do sorcery and to protect against sorcery. The list goes on. Even many of our pre-modern compatriots discovered that these things could be used for alcoholism, for a variety of different drug addictions. Are these truly panaceas? I will hesitatingly say, I think so. And I will just give you a few ideas why I think that is the case, and it's sort of one of the core arguments I make in the introduction to the book. About a decade ago, I introduced the concept of psycho-integrators as what I thought was a more appropriate term than the popular hallucinogen, not to replace other terms such as entheogen or psychedelic, but to reflect on the remarkable similarities that these plants induce in human consciousness and in the brain. And my understanding of these plants in terms of the neurotransmitter systems is that in a variety of different ways they enhance what serotonin does in our brain, and sometimes sort of take serotonin to a whole new level of functioning. In simple terms, what I see serotonin is doing in the brain is functioning not so much as a neurotransmitter, but as a neuromodulator. That is to say, its function is to modulate the activities of all the other different neurotransmitter systems. as well as to modulate activities across the levels of the brain. And I've been very fond of the neurobiologist Paul MacLean's model of the triune brain. And I find it very instructive to sort of interface the psycho-integrators with serotonin, with the triune brain, to understand why there's so many different things that these substances can be used to treat. At the level of what MacLean called the reptilian brain, our ancient behavioral brain, we find these substances basically opening up the channels of information. One of the things that serotonin does is to sort of keep a lid on the immense amount of information that our nervous system is capable of processing so that we can deal with what's most important. And what we know with these substances is that these dampening mechanisms of the brain are basically opened up. We get access to things that we normally have repressed or habituated. And so, as many of you well know, these substances all of a sudden make the world seem alive and vibrant as an entity that's really a kind of conscious, sentient being. And I think it's because now we have this immense amount of information that normally we are basically habituating or shunting out from consciousness. The next level of the brain, what MacLean called the paleo-mammalian brain, we find serotonin basically sort of regulating both the information that the emotional brain gets and passing it up to the frontal cortex. And once again, we see what these substances do is open up the emotional channels of the brain, open up the visual channels of the brain that incidentally played a significant role in primate and hominid and human evolution. So once again, we see this vast expansion of information being opened up to us that's always there but not normally available to consciousness. And then if we look at the serotonergic projections to the brain, they basically run up the brain stem, come out of the reptilian brain, project to our mammalian brain, and then diffusely project to the whole brain. So what is, I think, a characteristic signature of what I call the psycho-integrators are these hypersynchronous theta wave discharge patterns that link the three levels of the brain together. They basically bring the unconscious into consciousness. I remember as an undergraduate student, they said, oh, we only use 5% of our brain or 10% of our brain. And I always wonder, what's the other 90% doing? Well, it's keeping a lid on things. And I think what we can see the psycho-integrators as doing is basically opening ourselves up to the potentials of our own brains and integrating the behavioral, the emotional, and the cognitive into some kind of coherent system of understanding. So if you hear me refer time and time again in my talk to the psycho-integrators, it's because I prefer to think of them in those terms, not that psychedelic as mind manifesting isn't useful, or that terms such as entheogen don't have their context. But I think entheogen sort of leads us to the conclusion that it's merely a spiritual phenomena, and that in the context of being a spiritual phenomena, science might not have a role. And I prefer to think of them as psycho-integrators because of a variety of evolutionary impacts that they've had upon human consciousness and development. So, what is our basis for a legitimate use of psychedelic medicines? I think there can be a lot of different kinds of knowledge that we use. I'm sure some of you who are familiar with the medical protocols would say we must have the double-blind clinical studies. I'm sure that you may also recognize that most of the medicines in use today have not been subjected to double-blind clinical studies, and that even those that have become, in some cases, very dangerous drugs to even use in typical medical context. If we look at what medicine is often relied upon, it is beginning with things such as cross-cultural patterns. Medicine in the context of ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology is typically sought out knowledge about plant uses in other cultures to provide a basis for screening of phytochemicals to make an analog that can be patented so that millions of dollars can be made off of them. So medicine has often followed the time-honored tradition of finding out what people in other cultures do. Another approach is to say that basically these are religious substances or spiritual substances and that they should be treated as such and that we should be allowed to use them on that basis. The argument has gotten limited acceptance, although in the context of the United States, it's notable that two plant substances have come to be normalized within the judicial system. Peyote, with a history going back almost 100 years, although at this time largely limited to use by Native Americans. And then we have the ayahuasca churches, particularly the Unión de Vegetal, which only about 2 years ago won a Supreme Court decision that basically stayed the Attorney General's efforts to restrict their use, saying that at this time there was no evidence that there was considerable harm. These contexts I think are important ones for our continued use and exploration of these plants, but many of you would find yourself unwelcomed in the Peyote Church. Native Americans are not interested in anybody else, particularly white people, opening up their own branches of the Peyote Church, so we will largely be excluded from pursuing that venue. Whether or not the ayahuasca churches provide us with a venue to look at the extended application of these substances remain to be seen. They certainly are a very popular venue within Brazil. We certainly have the widespread use of the ayahuasca tourism in Peru and other parts of Latin America. And some of the ayahuasca churches have gotten legitimacy and acceptance in various countries in Europe and the United States. But I think for most of us, the idea of going to church to use peyote or ayahuasca probably seems a little antithetical to what we actually feel is the right context for using these things. So it's not going to be a good one for most of us to explore, although in a talk tomorrow I will look at some of those possibilities. I think the real question, apart from the political one that we'll address at the end of my talk and in Tom's talk, is there sound scientific evidence and good clinical evidence for using these substances? And I want to suggest that we do have evidence in the form of epidemiological evidence, in the form of triangulation, and in the form of what the Food and Drug Administration refers to as Phase 1 and Phase 2 studies. In Psychedelic Medicine, Eve Fresca writes a chapter called Therapeutic Guidelines, Dangers and Contraindications in the Therapeutic Applications of Hallucinogens, in which he really asked the question, what is the evidence that these substances are harmful in terms of evidence of mortality? And what he points out is that there really is very little evidence whatsoever that the broad class of substances that we refer to as psychedelic medicines do contribute to any adverse health outcomes. Certainly, as Eddie points out in the article, there are contraindications. There are certain categories of people that probably should not be administered these substances. But Eddie makes the point that even when we include everything that we could call abuse, along with what we might consider to be intelligent, well-directed use of these substances, there really is little evidence at all that they're harmful, particularly when we think about comparison drugs such as alcohol, which in the U.S. kills about 300,000 people a year. Tobacco kills 400,000 people a year. Prescription drugs may kill 100,000 people a year when they're applied in legitimate ways. So even when we look at all the different ways in which we can think about the problems related to toxicity, there's very little evidence that these substances really do present some kind of danger to humans that use them or perhaps even abuse them. In one of the chapters by Alper and Lotsoff, they introduced the idea of triangulation as another way to look at what is good scientific data regarding the legitimate use of these substances. And they indicate that we can use things such as animal research, where it's not possible to carry out human research. Animals have been studied, and we were able to do a variety of toxicology studies using animals. They point out that medical case studies has been one of the primary ways in which medicine has always made judgments about the utility of medicines, and that clinical judgment and clinical experience is also a significant set of guidelines to use in deciding when these substances are appropriate for use. They also point to the notion of the personal accounts of the people that use them themselves, and this is in the context of looking at people who have used these substances to try to address substance abuse problems. And many people who have employed them in this context have come back with reports about how they have been able to obtain and achieve sobriety through the use of these substances. So these three different forms of evidence can provide a good basis for assessing whether or not these substances are useful, even if we have not been able to get to the context of advanced clinical trials. I would also point to the cross-cultural uses and alleged effects, and in particular a principle that I've used for many years. If people in diverse parts of the world use the same plant for the same kind of condition, that is the kind of independent discovery and independent verification that I think we should pay attention to and give credence in terms of being good data regarding the effectiveness of a substance. Patient satisfaction and enhanced activities of daily living. Do people function better once they start to take these substances? And once again, thinking in the context of substance abusers who are addicted to opiates and things like this. And clearly, a lot of the evidence suggests that yes, they do begin to function much better. And then we can look at pharmacological studies. They give us some ideas of the mechanisms of action and give us a rationale for considering certain substances to, in fact, be good forms of treatment. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., which I understand has similar kinds of institutes in most countries for the approval of new medicines, has an idea that we should go through 4 phases, 4 kinds of trials in terms of assessing substances and whether or not they should be widely available as medicines. Phase 1 trials that are primarily concerned with issues of toxicity, but also trying to determine whether or not there are dangerous side effects and what might be appropriate doses. Phase 2 trials that evaluate small groups of patients for effectiveness and try to target doses for specific kinds of illnesses. And then the phase 3 trials, where we really begin the randomized clinical trials with large groups of patients that are designed to confirm effectiveness, monitor adverse effects, and often bring in a variety of control conditions that allow us to determine whether or not the substance is more effective than other commonly used treatments. And then the phase 4 trials, which are really concerned more with the long-term assessment and long-term benefits of the use of specific substances for specific conditions. Now, given what has been a virtual prohibition on human research with these substances for about 40 years, we don't have the ideal kinds of studies that we would like to have in order to assess where a variety of psychedelic medicines fall along this continuum. But in the psychedelic medicine book, we asked our various authors to assess how they viewed the different substances that they were experts in. And what we came to conclude is that in most cases, we find that there's a wide variety of substances that have, in general, passed the criteria of toxicology assessments, the phase 1 assessments. That in many cases, there are good phase 2 studies that give us an idea that these substances are likely to be effective for a variety of specific kinds of conditions. In some cases, the evidence is limited and more related to case studies rather than the ideal clinical studies that we would like to have. And at the same time, we should point out that it's virtually impossible to carry these out in a large-scale, systematic kind of way with the hundreds of millions of dollars that's normally necessary to carry them through the full range of clinical trials. So in this sense, I say that we can find most of these substances here have passed what would, in the context of other drugs, then be given widespread acceptance for exploration of other kinds of treatments beyond the ones that they were specifically evaluated for in the first place. So to sort of summarize this, I would say that the phase 1 safety data supports the wider applications of psychedelic medicines and their reclassification as Schedule II. And indeed, most phase 2 studies have already been done, although these were normally done in the 1950s and 1960s before the concept of the double-blind clinical study became the golden standard of medicine. And so a lot of these studies don't have controls that would eliminate placebo effects. I think we also have to ask the question of whether or not eliminating placebo effects is really what we want to do when we employ psychedelic medicines. If we go back to the notion that they're intervening in the serotonergic system, which is designed to modulate a lot of different aspects of our consciousness, behavioral, emotions, and cognitive, clearly using these substances in a way that allows people to focus their attention and to employ the suggestibility that these substances often evoke really should be part of how we assess them. In contemporary terms, we would talk about this as an integrative medicine approach, where we're combining various kinds of tools to see if we get an enhanced effect. So I think for a lot of reasons, the lack of placebo-controlled studies really shouldn't deter us from considering these substances to have adequate phase 2 evaluations. And we would point out that in many cases, there's good reasons to suggest that even phase 3 and phase 4 studies are already in effect being carried out. For instance, in a paradox, the federal government of the United States reimburses doctors who are medicine doctors who use peyote to treat alcoholics. So in our book, Joseph Calabrese documents this paradox where on one hand, it's a Schedule I substance without medical use, but on the other hand, the federal government will reimburse Indian doctors to treat alcoholic patients. So what should we be looking at here? I'll just give you an overview of some of the major points that come out of the book, and I must say that the book really is most useful because of the high caliber of people who have been contributors to it, and many of them are here at the conference. Andrew Sewell is here. He will talk about cluster headaches. He and John Halpern did an article on the response of cluster headache to psilocybin and LSD. And I think that this is one of the areas in which we start to see a new set of arguments that can be made for the use of these substances. And it's sort of a moral imperative argument, which is to say that there are conditions out there which are so fatal, literally, such as the cluster headaches, also referred to as suicide headaches, that anything that would help people ought to be considered justified. And in this context, what Halpern and Sewell discovered is that both LSD and psilocybin really are effective treatments with success rates that are in the high 90% compared to standard medical treatments that are probably only about 5%. Indeed, in the case of the cluster headaches, I would say, do we really need studies about this? Another point I would make about the research that they've done is that this didn't start off as medical research in the sense that someone with an MD was looking at some substances that might prove to be useful. Instead, what was happening was that people discovered on their own, gee, I did psilocybin and I haven't had a cluster headache for 6 or 8 or 10 months. I wonder if there's a relationship. And the next time it happens, they're out there on the street looking for psilocybin, and lo and behold, there goes the cluster headache in a matter of hours. So once again, I think if we decide to take psychedelic medicine seriously as potential medical treatments, we ought to look at what people in many cultures around the world have already been doing with these substances, at some cases for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Another contributor to our book who's here at the conference, Michael Mithofer, wrote on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. We also have another presenter here, Owen, who will be talking about his own studies on MDMA psychotherapy for PTSD. I think once again here we also have another moral imperative for the use of the psychedelic medicines. As Mithofer points out, there's about 10% of people who suffer trauma who end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he estimates that I think in the United States, about 8% of the population is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorders. This is once again a condition that does not have an acceptable treatment that's effective. And at this point in time, we are unfortunately in a situation where we are producing more and more cases. We note in the United States the high suicide rate among servicemen and women who are in Iraq, and a high suicide rate among them when they return. They're coming back and they're becoming violent abusers. They're emotionally traumatized, not only from what they did, but from what they saw happen and the carnage and atrocities of war in Iraq. They're people that are seriously in need of help, and at this point we don't have a treatment for them. And even getting George Bush out of office won't change that. So we need to find some way to try to deal with the serious problems that have been produced by these modern atrocities. And we have some good ideas about how to do it. Another set of contributors to our book, George Greer and Rekla Tolberg, write on therapeutic uses of MDMA, and they point out before the prohibition on MDMA, there was a development of a very clear set of guidelines regarding what are some of the best uses, best practices for employing these substances. So it's not as if we have to start off ignorant of how to use these kinds of medicines. We really, at this point, know how to use them, and we'll ultimately have to find a way to get the politicians to allow that to happen. Another condition that's talked about in our book by Michael Montage, psychedelic therapy for the treatment of depression. Clearly, depression is one of the most widely diagnosed conditions in the world today. It's the most widely treated condition with pharmaceuticals. There's an irony in it in that most physicians will tell you that the medicines that are being used to treat depression are considered to be pharmacologically ineffective after about 3 to 6 months. Of course, that doesn't keep people from using them for year after year after year and wondering why they're still depressed. So the major treatments that we have available now might be viewed as effective interrupters short term, but with questionable effectiveness in terms of long-term treatment goals. In terms of depression, the obvious relevance of serotonin enhancement therapies is indicated by the typical treatment modality, the SSRIs, the serotonin systematic reuptake inhibitors. However, if we look at how these psychedelic medicines might be employed for these substances, it's likely that single treatments over every 2 to 6 weeks might be effective in terms of producing what John Halpern has referred to as a psychedelic afterglow that leaves people with a positive affective state. Another article in our book, Psilocybin Treatment of Obsessive Compulsive Disorders by Moreno and Delgado, look at some of the ways in which they have come to find effective ways of dealing with OCD through the use of psilocybin. And while it's not a high priority illness perhaps, it certainly is one that has a lot of significance in terms of limited treatment effectiveness with conventional medical therapies. Another article in the book by Charles Grob, The Use of Psilocybin in Patients with Advanced Cancer and Existential Anxiety, addresses something that we all will have to address either in our own lives or in those of others, that is to say, the end-of-life issues. We'll also have other presenters here. Sumit Kumar on Saturday will be talking about a similar kind of research project. Grob, in his article, only had limited data available. He didn't want to break his double blind to assess all of the patients that had actually gone through his study. But I pulled a quote out of his article that I thought was really to the point, given the universality of the essential existential dilemma of death, that is to say, and the potential for optimally conducted hallucinogen treatment models to significantly enhance the quality of the end-of-life period, there's clearly a need to develop further research that will demonstrate the utility of this field of hallucinogenic medicine. So these are some of the more conventional areas in which physicians have begun to address how psychedelic medicines might be useful. I'm going to suggest that perhaps the most important of all of them really is in addictions treatment. And if we really combine all the different addictions that plague humans today, I think it's fair to say that drug addiction really is probably the greatest problem that humanity faces today. We lump together cigarettes and alcohol and the opiates, cocaine, etc. We have a major health problem that to date really does not have a medical solution. I don't know how people around the rest of the world deal with the treatment of addictions, but in the United States there really is only one accepted treatment approach. It's called Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Cocaine Anonymous, and basically it's a spiritual problem that requires that you get in contact with higher power, God as you understand it, and you undergo a transformation of consciousness that will enable you to see the error of your ways. Now I've sat in on a few AA meetings, and you can get a slight transformation of consciousness drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes with them, but I don't think it's a very effective transformation of consciousness compared to what can be done with LSD or psilocybin or any of the other psychedelic medicines. One of the paradoxes that I find in terms of this whole treatment field is that even the American Medical Association considers Alcoholics Anonymous to be the only acceptable treatment program for addicted physicians. You'd think at least the AMA would come to a pharmacological approach to these problems, but not as of yet. I think part of the problem is that there's a lack of consideration of what are the similarities between alteration of consciousness in general and the alterations of consciousness produced by addictive drugs. And Arnold Mandel, who really modeled my thinking about psycho-integrators, pointed out that it's the same underlying dynamic. It doesn't make any difference whether you meditate, whether you have an ecstatic experience from long distance running, whether you use any variety of different substances. They all induce the same kind of dynamics in the brain. The problem is that if you use things like the opiates, you interrupt the body's own production of serotonin and opioids, and so you end up with a dynamic of addiction that can't be overcome by taking more of it. Now, some people look at me like I'm crazy when I say that we should use LSD and psilocybin for drug addicts, but I think you are probably all well aware of the fact that these substances have virtually no addictive potential, at least physically. Clearly there are dynamics of psychological addiction that may go with them, but also their habituation effects tend to preclude the increasing use of the substances, as is typical with people who use opioids. So in volume 2 of Psychedelic Medicine, we look at 5 different major substances that are being used in a variety of contexts around the world to treat addictions. And I'll suggest that they can be seen as falling into 2 major clusters. One that are more clinical approaches and approaches in which physicians have played a major role in the applications of these substances. And then there's a variety of shamanic or shamanistic applications in which traditional types of rituals are the most important way in which the substances have been applied. I don't think that these substances are necessarily appropriate only for clinical or shamanic purposes. I think it's largely for historical reasons that they have fallen into one group or the other. So in the beginning of volume 2, we have an article by John Halpern that looks sort of at the history of the treatment of alcoholism and other addictions, primarily with LSD. And he makes some very important observations. He notes that there is good evidence that these substances were very effective for about 2 months, and that even 6-month to 9-month follow-up would show people given a single dose of LSD had much better sobriety than people who were just given mainstream psychotherapeutic approaches. He also notes that many of these early studies lack the kinds of double-blind clinical controls that we would like to have, and that consequently they have been largely discounted. But he pulls up a review article by Al-Boazab and Anderson in 1971 that did a meta-analysis of 31 early studies between 1953 and 1969 with alcoholics that looked at the potential of LSD in the treatment of addictions, and they found that there is an improvement of more than 50% over control groups with just one single dose. And what Halpern notes is that a lot of these studies use the case method approach to sort of follow up on particular individuals and discover that there was a kind of an afterglow effect that tended to last about 1 to 2 months. And then after that 1 to 2 month period, there tend to be recidivism of many of the people who received that single dose. Of course, in many cases, people did receive what we now call a psychedelic dose as opposed to a psycholytic dose. They had these life-transformative experiences in which they came to understand the nature of their own addictive dynamics and were able to make a transition to sobriety. So if we were to return to the use of LSD in the treatment of alcoholism, clearly the psychedelic model combined with treatments every 6 weeks to 8 weeks would be already well indicated by the literature that's available. One of the other articles in the book by Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer looks at a case study, one individual who was actually given a lot of media scrutiny back in the 1960s and followed his life and looked at how the single dose of LSD provided a profound transformation of his understanding of his own personal circumstances. And so in a sense, what the LSD model is sort of suggesting is the same thing that Alcoholics Anonymous does, is that there needs to be a change of consciousness. You have to have a recognition of your faults, your understandings, your problems, and how you have contributed to creating the addict that you are. And in that sense, the notion of the Psycho-integrator then makes sense once again, because what these substances do is basically dredge up from the lower brain levels, particularly stimulating the limbic brain and its memory connections to make these substances tools for enhancing our consciousness and awareness of what our past is, what has contributed to these problems. And this idea of encountering what happened in our past as a key to addictions therapies comes up time and time again. Another one of the substances that has gotten increased attention in recent years is ibogaine, a root that is originally used in ritual context in West Africa. Ken Alper and Howard Lossoff collaborated in doing an excellent review article on the use of ibogaine in the treatment of addictions. Valerie Majecchio will be doing a paper on the similar topic here on Saturday. I think that the interesting thing about ibogaine, once again, is that this was a discovery that didn't come out of medicine, but came out of the addict subculture. Addicts themselves discovered that ibogaine had the potential to serve as a dramatic interrupter of the dynamics of addiction and craving. And this is something that through animal studies, and it was Alper and Lossoff who suggested this triangulation approach, we know is not a placebo effect. You can do the same thing with rats, get them addicted to opiates. They will self-administer as much as they possibly can, give them a dose of ibogaine, all of a sudden they're not interested in the opiates anymore. So something fundamental has changed in terms of how their brain is handling information. In this context, I would also point out that it's not at all the case that serotonin is clearly the primary transmitter that's being manipulated by ibogaine. It's not clear at this point exactly what may be the underlying mechanisms. The general notions that have come out of many of the studies is that it's certain effects on areas of the brain that are hyperstimulated to the point that they may in fact involve the erasures of memory. And so Alper and Lossoff speculate that what may be happening with ibogaine is that we're basically giving the addicts a chance to wipe clean a sort of behavioral dynamic, a behavioral slate in which they have certain patterns of behavior that they repeat over and over again, and they can't seem to find their way out of that pattern. So you stimulate these parts of the brain that are engaged in behavioral memories, and all of a sudden, things are no longer the same. You don't have the same behavior. So this will probably be one of the areas in which we will likely find support for government research. In fact, the U.S. government did fund phase 1 studies back in the 1990s and had approved phase 2 studies, and then they abruptly dropped the funding for continued studies. So now there's a whole medical subculture that has emerged in the use of ibogaine. It continues underground in the U.S. It's key to the harm reduction movement in the Netherlands, and it's being employed in many areas of the Caribbean, in Mexico and Canada and other parts of the world where it is not prohibited by law. So in one sense, this may end up being a poster child for psychedelic medicine treatment of addictions just because it hasn't come into legal restrictions. Ketamine, a substance that normally has been considered a dissociative. Its original approved uses was in the context of surgery, and it is not normally considered to be a psychedelic or hallucinogen, although those of you who have employed subclinical doses are probably aware that it can have many of the same kinds of effects that we associate with peak psychedelic experience, albeit normally in much shorter periods of time. One of the interesting potentials that comes out of ketamine is that this substance is already an approved drug. It's already gone through the 4 phases of evaluation in terms of clinical safety and use. And so now it's in a context in which we would call off-label uses. Evgeny Krupitsky on Sunday will talk about his own research, which I think would be another one of the areas in which psychedelic medicine may find itself having the potential to catapult itself to the forefront of addictions therapy once people realize the powerful potential that this substance has. So peyote is one of the shamanic approaches to treatment of addiction. Once again, it's one of these treatment approaches that has been discovered not by medicine as much as it has been discovered by people who are engaged in the use of these substances. Joseph Calabrese writes an article, The Therapeutic Use of Peyote in the Native American Church, in which he looks at sort of the history and dynamics of the treatment of addictions with peyote. One of the things I should point out about peyote is that it is generally considered to be the only effective treatment of alcoholism in Indian country. And even people who have been sort of wed to the model of the Alcoholics Anonymous approach to treatment of addictions have come to generally agree that Native Americans who are addicted to alcohol or other substances don't get clean by AA or NA alone. It takes the peyote way to really make it happen for them. There's a lot of discussion in the literature among a variety of people, Halpern, Calabrese, Aberle, regarding just what is the therapeutic mechanism of the peyote way. One of the interesting aspects of the use of peyote is that in most cases it's a subclinical dose. And you're taking one button, where as many as 10 or 15 or 20 buttons might be considered a psychedelic dose. So it's not at all the case that we can say that a large amount of a pharmacological agent is what's responsible for inducing the dramatic changes that we find. Indeed, people who have looked at the dynamics of the peyote way say, well, what's most important here is you have a community of people who say, you're not supposed to drink anymore, and we're not going to let you drink anymore. So you've got a social support system, which of course is one of the things that AA touts as being key to sobriety. Another important part of the peyote way is that it uses an overnight ritual. In some of the stricter contexts, you go into the Hogan at 6 or 7 in the evening, and you don't get out to pee or poop or anything till the next morning. So it's sort of a strenuous activity that keeps you up all night, normally prohibited from drinking water, and you're singing and chanting all night long. In this context, Calabrese says that peyote really ought to be seen as a kind of cultural psychiatry rather than a pharmacological agent. He talks about these meaning therapies and sees peyote as a desemanticizing agent. He sees the peyote ritual as really sort of pulling people out of one worldview and allowing them to get a glimpse of another one. One of the things that Native Americans experienced was pretty much the total loss of their religion. In the latter part of the 19th century, the federal government of the United States made it a felony to practice Native American rituals. And so the few that survived had to go underground. And most Native American groups lost their spirituality altogether to have it replaced with Quakerism or Protestantism or whoever happened to be getting money from the federal government to colonize Native Americans at that time. And so they really ended up in the 20th century as a people, in a sense, without a soul, or at least without a spiritual tradition to support that soulful longing for these transformative experiences. So in this sense, peyote may really have its most powerful transformative effects really through the dramatic community rituals that are induced overnight with the drumming and the chanting and the singing. Now, this isn't to rule out altogether pharmacological effects. In his review of the treatment of alcoholism with a variety of substances, Halpern also points to an afterglow effect from the peyote. One might suspect that Halpern is speaking from personal experience. Once again, a kind of pharmacological elevation, what in the old days we used to call the shit-eating grin that you just had for a few days after you did some of these wonderful substances. So I think that there is a pharmacological effect here, but I think in the context of the peyote way, it's probably more a cultural therapy than the pharmacology as the primary agent. On the other hand, in the case of ayahuasca, the way in which it's been employed for the treatment of addictions by Jacques Mabit in Peru clearly has a dominant pharmacological approach. And in that sense, I would point to the fact that what he does is basically put people through what might be considered in broad terms a kind of shamanic initiation. You start off with large doses of the substances that are used as purgatives. They're then graduated to additions of other plants. People spend up to weeks at a time out in the jungle alone under the supervision of traditional healers. And that his treatment program is typically considered to be a 7 to 8 month or longer program for basically changing who you are as an individual. And in this sense, I think that while the shamanic elements are clearly key to what he does, it's also the case that the pharmacological agents, and a number of them, not just the primary plant combinations of ayahuasca, are viewed as being key. So later today, we will have a presentation by Lezoigel Velder that apparently is looking at either some of her own or somebody else's research about the use of ayahuasca in the treatment of addictions. So we're not starting off anew if we turn to psychedelic medicines for the treatment of addictions. We have a good set of ideas about best practices and treatment protocols. Torsten Passy, who's also speaking here, provides an overview in the book about contemporary psychedelic therapy and some of the lessons that have been learned about the best uses. Neil Goldsmith provides a kind of eclectic view that combines both what's known by Western psychotherapy with what has been discovered in other cultures in terms of the best uses of this. In shamanic guidelines for psychedelic medicine, I look at how shamanic cultures have typically employed these substances. And some of these ideas have made their way into the Western world in mushroom circles and things like this, although I think that there are many clear shamanic guidelines that have yet to be fully endorsed. For instance, a long-term fasting beforehand, sexual abstinence would be another one. These are not practices that are typically considered to be important in the modern uses of psychedelic therapies. And then Sean House provides an article that looks at common processes in psychedelic-induced psychospiritual change. And I think what's perhaps most significant about his article is that he finds some key kernels of psychedelic therapy insights in many different therapeutic traditions that haven't relied upon these tools, but have emphasized that effects that these tools produce are key to the therapeutic process. So in one sense, we might say that all psychotherapy might be done better with these substances. So how can we get to the next step of effective application? In the conclusions to Volume 1, Tom and I take an interdisciplinary approach that talks about what might be needed political venues for doing this, what might be some of the ways in which, for instance, initiative processes can change in our own country, how these substances are made available. We've seen this with a variety of what have been called marijuana initiatives in Arizona and California, but have often been far more inclusive. It included the psychedelic drugs as well. We also point to the importance of educational approaches. In general, people are totally ignorant about these substances and what they can do. And so we're hoping that psychedelic medicine may literally provide a textbook for trying to educate the public, as well as legislatures, as well as doctors themselves about the significance of these substances. We've also touched briefly on what might be called ecumenical approaches. And I think sometime tomorrow afternoon I'm supposed to do a forum on ecumenical approaches and intentional community development to look at some of the ways in which these substances are and can be employed in therapeutic or quasi-therapeutic context. Thank you.